Hello and welcome to Economic Divide with me, Kavita Hawaii. In this week's episode, we will be assessing the wealth accumulation of the world's richest billionaires and look into just how during a global pandemic that costs trillions, some were able to make billions. Now, there are an estimated 2,200 billionaires in the world who have a combined wealth of around $11.4 trillion, a figure that is based on the total value of stock prices. Yet this figure is up some 20% from the year 2019, which stood at around $9.5 trillion. Now, looking at this chart, we can see that the billionaires in the US have profited more than most when it comes to making money in the pandemic, with household names like Jeff Bezos from Amazon, Elon Musk from Tesla, Bill Gates from Microsoft, and Mark Zuckerberg from Facebook at increasing their wealth to over $100 billion. Now, when we look into the net wealth seen by the world's richest people, the figures hit home even harder. In 2020 alone, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos topped the world's richest person list, with Musk seeing a 529% increase in his net worth, equating to $129 billion in extra cash, whilst Bezos enjoyed a 65% increase, Gates 23%, and Zuckerberg 86%, which, as I'm sure you'll agree, make far better returns on their money than the average family bank account rates. So, let's dive straight into our first report of the show and look in more detail as to just how some of these big-name CEOs and their brands made so much money whilst the world around them plummeted into economic crisis at the hands of COVID-19.
The impact of the coronavirus has not only had a devastating impact on the friends and family of those who have sadly lost their lives, but on a wider scale, the economic impact has seen GDP slump, companies close down, jobs lost, and people slipping into poverty at rates never seen before. So one can therefore legitimately question as to just how many of the world's richest people, owning wealth in the tens and hundreds of billions of dollars, have managed to get even richer, while so many others around them have headed in the opposite direction.
At the same time as specific companies have benefited from the pandemic and clearly others have lost, there's a kind of general thing that economic policy has been to kind of lower interest rates, to have policies like quantitative easing that the Bank of England have been doing. And that's been pushing up asset prices more generally. And that means that overall, in a way you'd think in a time when there's a pandemic, when the economy is being shut down, you'd expect a stock market crash. And instead what we've seen is generally kind of rises across the board. And so I think that what that touches on is the fact that, macro policy has had this effect of increasing the value of wealth, of the stuff that people own.
With so many businesses closing their doors, one could assume that billionaires who have profited did so due to the virus. After all, the majority of the world's top 10 billionaires are involved in the tech industry, and with lockdowns in full swing across the world, the likes of Amazon and Microsoft have thrived as they deliver goods around towns and cities, avoiding people leaving their homes and connecting people via the likes of Zoom and WhatsApp. However, the reality is far from the scenario just mentioned. In fact, those seeing billions in profits did so by betting on the recovery of global stock markets. This not only boosted the wealth of many billionaires, but also created a record number of new ones. During the first lockdown in early 2020, stocks and share prices were plummeting. This not only allowed those super rich investors to buy stocks at super low prices, it also saw their own companies affected. However, as the only group of people in the world able to risk such large amounts of money, the classic tactic of buy low and sell high saw the vast majority of profits hit the bank accounts of the rich. Furthermore, their own company stocks and shares also surged in prices, with Elon Musk's Tesla being a fine example, as its share prices flew up. However, the opposite end of the scale saw many people falling into poverty. For example, 8 million extra people were recorded in the US. Of these, the black and ethnic minority communities were worse affected, with 5.4% more on average falling into the poverty bracket. What now remains to be seen is whether Joe Biden's rescue plan will help the poor get back on their feet. Yet the sums of money proposed is still much less than the net worth of the American billionaires, showing that even the state is struggling to compete with the huge sums of money circulating in the hands of a very select few.
Joining me in the studio is current affairs and impact analyst Mahan Abedin. Mahan, welcome. We also have Baron Prem Sika of Basildon, who is an emeritus professor of accounting at Essex University and a member of the British House of Lords. Okay, Professor, many thanks for being with us on Economic Divide. First up, the global pandemic. It has seen many people succumb both physically and financially to this virus, yet large multinational company owners at Amazon, Tesla, and Microsoft have seen their wealth increased in the billions. Do you think this is the right time for such companies to invest their huge profits into greater causes? For example, distributing the vaccines to global South countries in poverty, as an example.
Well, first of all, thank you for having me on your program. Yes, what we have seen is that ordinary people's lives have been decimated by COVID pandemic. It is generally the poor and generally the poor and the less well-off who've been most affected, and they continue to suffer while, as you rightly say, large multinational companies continue to make profits. Well, in principle, we could expect them, as it were, to provide free vaccine to their workers and to their consumers, but that is not what they are going to do. So the state must act, and the state must act by ensuring that these organizations pay the taxes which they should be paying rather than avoiding them, and that would actually fund the vaccine program.
All right, Mohan, we have seen the huge profits that are being made by the likes of Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos. Do you think that the conditions set forth by the COVID-19 pandemic have actually played into their hands, and this being yet another case of the rich profiting of the misery of others?
Well, in a nutshell, yes, but I think to be fair, these big corporations, the multinationals, and the fabulously wealthy people behind them, they're always well positioned to benefit from these type of events, be they pandemics, big natural disaster, a huge global war perhaps. They're well positioned to benefit. Because the macroeconomic and microeconomic settings really suits them. What happened during the COVID-19 pandemic? A lot of small to medium-sized businesses went bust, so that inevitably expands the market share for the big corporations. Also, buying patterns on the part of individuals changed as people couldn't go out, for instance, and governments really encouraged people to stay in, especially in Western Europe, in North America. So people tended to do more and more online shopping. And that also benefited the big corporations at the expense of the small firms in the high street. Now, I think is a little bit even more sinister than that, because what we've seen during this pandemic in the past year is that key individuals, some of the richest people on the planet, Bill Gates, for instance, the founder of Microsoft, really pushing this vaccination program in a very aggressive way. Now, I'd hate to dabble into conspiracy theories, but you do begin to wonder about whether there's ulterior motives. In the UK, you had Tony Blair, an infamous prime minister for 10 years, responsible for Iraq war and all the atrocities, saying people need COVID passports to travel. So, on the face of it, these people appear altruistic, but from their past behavior, we know that they are incredibly selfish people. So you do begin to wonder about possible ulterior motives.
Of course, thank you. We appreciate that, Mohan Abedin there. And thank you to Baron Sika. We'll be seeing them both again later in the show. Let's now take a look at our second report that examines how the ultra-rich elite are able to stay rich using legal loopholes and whether government should crack down on such schemes.
When one thinks of tax avoiding and evasion, it's easy to think about the numerous tax havens around the world, from Monaco in the south of France to the ultra-niche islands in the Caribbean, all offering the richest people in the world a safe and secure place to store their cash and business dealings away from prying eyes. Recent events have shown just how big a scale the problem is, demonstrated in detail through leaked papers such as the FinCEN files and the Panama Papers, which not only named and shamed some of the rich and famous who had taken advantage of the system, but also embroiled several heads of states from around the world, showing that the problem stems from the bottom to the very top. However, there's a much more sinister way of avoiding taxes, and a way that on the surface, if used correctly and sensibly, will no doubt benefit millions of people around the world. In fact, many examples of philanthropy exist and have proven this. Take, for example, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which has to date given money to those in poverty, those in need of education, and a host of vaccines, essentially eradicating polio through the foundation. However, there's a dark side and abuse of the philanthropy system, namely the fact that so many of the world's richest people use philanthropy to avoid paying taxes, as you don't have to pay taxes on the parts of your income that you donate. Tax avoidance schemes, according to CNBC, could cost the US alone as much as $5 trillion over the next decade, and this sum would come from only the top 1% of taxpayers. Yet it seems the problem is twofold. Not only are the companies and individuals involved finding ways to avoid the taxman, but the taxman himself is not performing, with only 3% of the richest people in the US being audited by the IRS. With so many people around the world avoiding paying tax on a monumental scale, should the governments and authorities not be doing more to stop this problem?
Now looking at, for further revenue, governments are going to be thinking, well, where's the next place we're going to get money? And they're often not going to be able to just repeat what they did last time, whether that was increasing taxes on the sort of majority of the population, or whether that was cutting back on the state. And so I think, one natural area to kind of clamp down on is some of these reliefs and loopholes. But again, I think it's worth remembering, often this idea of describing it as a loophole or relief is a way of a politician saying, there is this problem here and it's somehow being used unreasonably, and that's fine. But then they should go, politicians then have it within their gift to change those things.
All right, back in the studio with Mahan Abedin and Professor Sika. Professor, let me start with you. It seems that the richest people and companies around the world have found ways to exploit taxes through loopholes and investment schemes, many of them preferring fines, which often amount to less than the profits being made. You pointed that out. Should there be then a tougher approach on measures fighting this by the government and the authorities?
Well, these companies are only able to avoid taxes because the governments let them. Governments can enact tougher laws, but they don't, because the big corporations and richer people are able to fund political parties. And in a sense, they are not making donations. What they are making is investment. And the return on that investment is that they have become a law unto themselves. They avoid taxes. They engage in all kind of artificial profit-shifting tax schemes. They concoct transactions which have absolutely no economic substance. And many of these companies are hiding their profits in what are commonly called British Crown dependencies and overseas territories, places like Jersey, Guernsey, Gibraltar, Isle of Man, and many others. So the British government can deal with these companies, these small islands, so can other countries too. But actually the political will is not there because our political system is actually inept. It works against the interests of ordinary people. So we have a position in the UK at the moment where some of the poorest people are paying 40%, 42% of their total income in direct and indirect taxes, compared to the rich people who are paying about 34% of their total income in taxes. That is immoral, and that must be addressed.
Okay, Mahan, looking at the opposite end of the spectrum here, whilst the rich are getting richer, the poor actually falling deeper into poverty. Maybe that's one of the reasons, or the taxes, the way that it's being exercised on them. Do you think that the wealth gap is actually widening and deepening because the rich are allowed to exploit these loopholes like taxes? And how can the gap be bridged then in the near future?
Again, in a nutshell, yes. And look, the gap cannot be bridged because, as your guest correctly pointed out, the political will isn't there. Now, we know that the political systems in Western Europe, particularly in the UK, and also in North America, they are very corrupt.
Okay, thank you very much for that. We are going to now take a short break actually here on Economic Divide, but please don't go anywhere as we have plenty more coming up after these short messages, so stay right where you are. Welcome back to Economic Divide with me, Kavita Ahwai. Time now to take a deeper look into this week's topic in our in-depth section. The collective wealth of all U.S.-based billionaires increased by just over $1.1 trillion since mid-March of 2020. Now that is a near 40% increase in wealth during a period of national emergency. The huge sum of money could pay for the relief for working families in the U.S. contained in the $1.9 trillion coronavirus package proposed by U.S. President Joe Biden. Well, the combined fortune of U.S.'s 660 billionaires in January of 2021 was around $4.1 trillion. That's up some 38.6% year on year. However, it is the fact that some 46 new billionaires were formed in the U.S. during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic that really raises the eyebrows as to, well, how that could have come from 614 people prior to the outbreak. Looking at the opposite end of the scale, ordinary Americans have not fared as well as the billionaires. According to the Department of Labor, over 73 million people lost their jobs during the pandemic, with 16 million people collecting unemployment checks. Unlike the likes of Amazon and Tesla, some 100,000 businesses also permanently closed during the pandemic. Now, things did not end there. According to the Economic Policy Institute, some 12 million workers also lost their employer-sponsored health insurance, whilst the Center of Budget and Policy Priorities stated that 29 million American adults reported their households did not have enough food to eat, with 12 million children going hungry as incomes dried up and mouths could no longer be fed. Let's take a look at our final report, which studies why during the toughest of times, governments are still forking out billions to private companies, once again putting cash into the pockets of the rich.
There's no doubting the notion that the state and private corporations live and work hand in hand. In fact, it's the very backbone of capitalism that allows private enterprise. On many occasions, the state needs to use private companies in order to fulfill its needs, be it through transport, education, infrastructure or more. The relationship goes hand in glove in order for a state to operate and provide the facilities that citizens are entitled to enjoy. However, there are occasions when the relationship between states and private sectors could be questioned, particularly when it comes to the state forking out multi-million-dollar contracts to companies during a time when spending and priorities should be stricter than ever.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the context of the pandemic, the issue has really been sort of do what works best when it's possible. So, I mean, in the UK, for example, the NHS has been heavily involved in the rolling out of a vaccine, and that's been really important. Using the state and the capacity that we already have in the UK to do that has been really, really useful. But at the same time, transporting these sort of ultra cold vaccines around the place, you have to keep them at minus 80 or whatever it is. The government contracted Boots and Superdrug to be able to use their, freezer lorries to take stuff around, and that was a sensible use of public money spent moving into private hands, but that's where the capacity is to go ahead and move stuff around.
One such example is a recent contract won by billionaire Elon Musk and his SpaceX company. The US Space Development Agency, run by the US military and hence a government entity, has recently tendered a contract of $150 million for SpaceX to launch 28 satellites on behalf of the Pentagon. As recently as this month, NASA has also selected SpaceX to launch an astrophysics mission, once again seeing Musk's company earn a tidy $98.8 million for the honour, raising the question as to just whether such spending in times of such crisis can be warranted, as well as asking whether Musk is being favoured in the deals taking place. In total, Musk's various companies ranging from Tesla, SpaceX and Solar City Corp have benefited from just under $5 billion of government support, a figure that seems to highlight a common factor between governments and multi-billion-dollar enterprises.
Joining me back in the studio for the final time in this episode is Current Affairs and Impact Analyst Mohan Abedin, and we also have Baron Prem Sika, Emeritus Professor of Accounting from Essex University. Gentlemen, welcome back. Thank you. Okay, Professor, my last question. Why some companies are earning multi-million-dollar contracts with the governments? We can mention as an example Elon Musk, SpaceX being one example, and hence raising the question as to whether governments around the world should consider other priorities before funding private individuals and companies, particularly during the ongoing pandemic.
I think you just put your finger on one of the biggest fictions in the Western world, this claim that we have so-called free markets. These free markets are funded by the state, not only through various contracts for private companies, but also through subsidies and the provision of social infrastructure, roads, railways, healthcare for employees, education for everybody, and at the end, the corporations benefit. So I think the balance at the moment that we have in our societies about private and public spheres is incorrect, and it is wrong, and it is enabling some to make mega profits. And then you find the companies which are benefiting, and you mentioned Apple, Microsoft, many others, they then decide to dodge taxes. In other words, they refuse to put something back into the pot, the very pot which has enabled them to flourish and make even more profits. But I think ordinary people are more and more sensitized now to tax avoidance, and they are demanding change. And the governments should listen, but at the moment they are not listening. But that call for social justice will get louder and louder, because in the post-COVID world, we need to rebuild our society on principles of social justice. We can't go back to the world which existed before, where millions of people are increasingly barely surviving, while the number of billionaires who are exploiting society and those people is increasing.
All right, many thanks to you, Professor Prem-Sikka. It's been a pleasure having you on this program.
Well, thank you for speaking to me, and it's been a great pleasure to be on your program.
Very well. Well, if you'd like to know more about corporate tax avoidance, the banking empire, and secret offshore wealth funds, be sure to check out The Spider's Web, Britain's Second Empire documentary on YouTube, which explores the issue and in which Professor Prem-Sikka features in. The link is on your screens right now. Okay, Mahan, my final question now to you. As we know, many of the richest people in the world have direct links to the government. We've been saying that, either through being part donors or through being involved in government through some kind of medium. Is there enough transparency when it comes to allocating government contracts, for example, or are they likely chosen even before they are offered to the tender?
No, there isn't. But I'd just like to go back to something your guest said, because he's not the only one to echo this thought that we need to have this great reset after the pandemic is over, start afresh. This is an opportunity for change. In principle, that sounds nice, but it's just not going to happen. You know, people are going to go back to the old ways. There isn't sufficient will, nowhere near the will that's required to reset the system. And I think the Western world, in terms of how its economy is configured and how the associated politics is run, is too deeply entrenched for any great reformation. It's just not going to happen.
Very well. Thank you very much for that, Mahan Abedin, Current Affairs and Impact Analyst. We also like to thank Professor Prem-Sikka. Right now it's time to take a look at our regular piece, 1,000 Words. There's no doubt that money makes money. This has proven to be true more than ever as the ultra-rich become even richer during times of hardship. Whilst at the opposite end of the economic ladder, poverty is on the rise across the poorest deciles of society. Yet there also seems to be an unfair advantage. The recent purchase of $1.5 billion of Bitcoin by Elon Musk saw the value of the cryptocurrency surge to a record high of over $44,000 each, simply because of Musk's endorsement of the currency. Could this extreme power hence be adding to the wealth of those able to perform such acts? Yet it seems that very little is being done to stop wealthy individuals getting richer, with governments also in on the act of lining the pockets of Musk, Bezos, and more, hence seeing many enjoy double jackpot profits for their companies and for themselves. Remember, we want to hear from you, so drop us a line, tell us what you think of the show and why. Not even drop us suggestions of stories that you want us to cover. That's all the time we have for week's show. On behalf of myself, Kavita and the whole team here on Economic Divide, thanks for watching, stay safe, and we'll see you again next time.